I always knew something was off about my marriage. Not in the big, dramatic, throw a glass against the wall kind of way. More like a small, nagging itch that you can't reach. The kind that sits just under your skin and waits for the perfect moment to drive you insane. It wasn't that Susan had been distant lately. No, that would have been too obvious. She still laughed at my jokes, still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still argued with me about how I folded towels the wrong way. Everything was just as it always had been, except for one thing. She had started being nice. And not the I love my husband kind of nice. It was the overly careful, walking on eggshells. I hope you don't notice something kind of nice. Like a waiter who spills your drink but keeps smiling because they're hoping you won't complain. The problem was, I always notice. I just didn't know what I was looking for. Then came the basketball game. A week ago, Susan came home with 2 tickets to see the Knicks play. Floor seats. Now, let me be clear. I like basketball just fine. But Susan? Susan hates sports. She thinks defense is what neighbors put up when they don't want you parking in front of their house. The last time I tried watching a game on TV, she sighed so dramatically you'd think I was forcing her to sit through a 6-hour documentary on the history of concrete. And yet, here she was, smiling like a woman who'd just been enlightened by the basketball gods. "I thought we could do something fun," she said, placing the tickets in my hand like a cat dropping a dead bird at my feet. That should have been the first red flag. The second red flag? The seats. Floor seats for a Knicks game aren't just something you casually stumble upon. They're the kind of thing you either inherit or owe someone your soul for. But I ignored my instincts. Maybe she was trying to spice things up. Maybe she felt guilty about something small, like deleting an Amazon package before I saw it. I told myself it was fine. Until tip-off. We got to the arena, and it was everything I expected. Rowdy fans, overpriced beer, a guy behind us who had already lost his voice screaming at players who couldn't hear him. The game started, and I was actually enjoying myself, right up until halftime. That's when my entire life came crashing down. It started with the camera. You know, those in-game cameras that scan the crowd and put people on the Jumbotron? Yeah. One minute, they were showing some excited kids dancing in their seats. The next, they were zooming in on a very specific couple, a man and a woman, tangled up in their own little world, laughing, whispering, kissing. The crowd cheered, because that's what you do when the Jumbotron catches romance in action. I even started clapping instinctively, like some kind of moron. Then, all at once, my brain caught up with my eyes. Because that woman? That was my wife. And the man? Was not me. Now, I want to be clear about something. I've always imagined how I'd react if I ever found out Susan was cheating. Maybe I'd have a dramatic moment of silence, like in the movies. Maybe I'd feel my heart rip out of my chest. Maybe I'd stand up and cause a scene. But instead, I just sat there, blinking at the screen like an error message had just popped up in my brain. Susan was right next to me, frozen in place, gripping her beer like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. And then the real fun started. The camera zoomed in, and that's when the arena's speaker system, in all its glory, decided to deliver the final blow. And let's give it up for the newlyweds. Congratulations! I tell to you, time stopped. The crowd roared. People whistled. The man on the Jumbotron pulled Susan closer and kissed her again, completely unaware that the actual husband of his wife was sitting just a few feet away, experiencing a level of public humiliation previously reserved for bad karaoke singers and failed half-court shots. I turned to Susan. She was pale. "Joe," she started. "I can explain." "Oh, I bet you can." Her eyes darted back to the screen, where her other husband was now grinning like a man who had no idea he was seconds away from being featured in a true crime podcast. The only reason I didn't get up and throw my nachos at the guy was because I was too busy trying to process the absolute circus that had just been dumped in my lap. My wife, had apparently married someone else. And thanks to modern technology and the worst seat selection in human history, I had just found out in front of 20,000 people. My stomach turned. Susan looked like she was about to pass out. The guy on screen? Still completely clueless. Then, as if the universe hadn't humiliated me enough, a fan behind us leaned forward and patted me on the back. "Hey man, he said sympathetically. That's gotta sting. I had nothing. 0 words. No plan. Just one horrifying realization. This wasn't just cheating. This was an entire second life. And I had just found out about it in the middle of a basketball game. To the sound of cheering fans, I stood there, watching Susan disappear into the hallway at full sprint, pursued by a security guard whose job description probably did not include chasing rogue wives through Madison Square Garden. At this point, I had accepted that my night was no longer about basketball. I turned, half expecting another surprise, and sure enough, there it was. A man, mid-40s, clean-cut, nice suit, looked like the kind of guy who owned a boat and made sure you knew about it within the first 5 minutes of conversation. He walked straight up to me like he'd been waiting for this moment all his life. Joe Reynolds? I frowned. Who's asking? He studied me, then let out a quiet, amused huff. Huh. Unbelievable. Not the most reassuring response. I crossed my arms. You want to tell me what's unbelievable? Or are we just doing cryptic statements tonight? He ignored that. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Then, without a word, he turned the screen toward me. And that's when I almost lost my mind. Because staring back at me was a wedding photo. Not mine. Susan's. And not with the guy from the Jumbotron. With him. My brain briefly shut off like a TV losing signal. What? The man, Susan's third husband, apparently, kept his expression perfectly neutral. Yeah, that was my reaction too. All right, let's just do a quick check-in. 1 hour ago, I thought I was watching a basketball game with my wife. 30 minutes ago, I found out she was secretly married to another man. And now, I was standing in a hallway with a second mystery husband, looking at his wedding photo with my wife. I took a slow, deep breath. Okay, I said, very carefully. So, what's your name? Greg Benson. And how long have you been married to Susan? 6 years. My eye twitched. 6 years. He nodded. Right, I said. Because why not? Greg didn't react. He just stood there, completely unfazed, like this was a business meeting and not a total collapse of reality. So, I said, rubbing my temples. Just so I'm clear, Susan has 3 husbands. That we know of. I closed my eyes for a second. Greg, I need you to understand something. That sentence? That's the worst sentence anyone has ever said to me in my entire life. Yeah, Greg said, nodding. It's not great on my end either. There was a beat of silence. Then I sighed and motioned between us. So what now? You planning to fight me in the parking lot or something? Greg actually laughed. Joe, he said, I just found out about you 30 minutes ago. That's funny. I found out about you right now. Another silence. Then Greg gave me a look. She got you floor seats, didn't she? I blinked. What? The game, he said, nodding toward the arena. That's how she tried to keep you distracted, right? I narrowed my eyes. She got you tickets too? No, she bought me a car. I had nothing. No words. No thoughts. Just an overwhelming desire to locate the nearest wall and put my head through it. Greg sighed, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Look, I don't know how much of the Susan experience you've had yet, but let me guess. She kept you busy, right? Just enough that you didn't start asking questions? I clenched my jaw. Because yes, that was exactly right. She had been distracting me. With vacations. With gifts. With sudden, out-of-nowhere acts of kindness that felt more like bribes now that I was looking back at them. And I had fallen for all of it. Greg sighed. I don't know how long she's been juggling all of this, but trust me, she's been covering her tracks for a long time. I stared at him. Then, slowly, I shook my head. Greg, I'm gonna be honest with you. I really thought I was having a bad night. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. Joe, I've been living your bad night for the last 6 years. That was it. That was the moment I decided that I no longer had any control over my own life. Because my wife didn't just cheat on me. She built an entire system, and I had only just discovered the first floor. I stood there, looking at Greg Benson, a man I had met exactly 3 minutes ago, and yet was somehow also married to my wife. If there was a manual for how to process something like this, I had not read it. Greg, to his credit, looked like a man who had already accepted his fate. His expression was that of someone who had long passed the stage of being angry and had entered the rare, hollow territory of complete resignation. I wasn't there yet. So, I said, rubbing my face, just to confirm, Susan has been running a fully functional multi-husband operation for how long, exactly? Longer than you'd think, Greg replied. But don't worry, it gets worse. That's a bold statement, I said. Considering I just found out I've been part of a secret marriage rotation program. Greg nodded, then pulled out his phone again and started scrolling. She ever mention a guy named Mark to you? I sighed. Greg, why would I know that name? You and I just met because I found out she's been playing husband bingo. I think we've established that Susan and I did not have the full disclosure kind of marriage. Greg turned his phone around, and there it was. Husband number 4. Mark Sullivan, mid-30s. Seemed normal enough, aside from the fact that he was also apparently married to my wife. Greg pointed at the screen. This is where things start getting complicated. I blinked. Oh, now things are complicated? Greg ignored that. Mark isn't just some guy. Mark is, how do I put this, a planner. I stared at him. Greg, I really need you to stop talking in riddles and just tell me whatever disaster you're about to drop on me. Greg took a deep breath. Mark set up a shared calendar. I felt actual physical pain. You're telling me Susan has so many husbands that she needed to implement a scheduling system? Yup. A shared calendar. Like, for appointments. Greg nodded. I clenched my jaw. I swear to everything that is holy, if you tell me there's a color-coding system, I'm going to need to sit down. Greg flipped the screen back toward himself, tapped a few buttons, then turned it back to me. Red, blue, green, yellow, multiple time slots. I exhaled slowly. She organized us like a doctor's office. Greg actually laughed at that. Yeah, your Wednesdays, by the way. Excuse me? Yeah, Greg said, scrolling through the nightmare before us. See? Joe. Every Wednesday, Friday if needed. I reached for my own head, convinced that at some point I had suffered a head injury and was actually in a coma, imagining all of this as some elaborate stress dream. Wednesdays, I muttered. You're telling me Susan had a rotation? Greg nodded. I pointed at the phone. And you're what? Thursdays? Monday and Thursday. Great. Fantastic. And what about Jumbotron Guy? Saturday. Of course. And Mark? Sunday. And, Greg added, tapping the screen, he's got the worst deal because he actually thinks he's the only one. I stared at him. You're telling me she was honest with us, but not with him? Yup. So Mark doesn't know about us? Correct. And we didn't know about Mark. Bingo. I took a long, deep breath. Greg, how did you find out? Greg's face went blank for a second. Then, very carefully, he said, Susan's mom accidentally invited me to the wrong Thanksgiving. I almost blacked out. She invited. I stopped, hands in my hair. Greg, how do you mess up a Thanksgiving invitation? Greg sighed. Apparently, she thought she was texting Mark. But because my name starts with the same letter, she sent it to me instead. I blinked. That's how you found out? Yup. So you just, what? Showed up at the wrong house? Well, I didn't know it was the wrong house, Greg said. I thought Susan was just hosting it somewhere new. So I showed up, sat down, started talking to everyone, and then Mark walked in. I had no response. Greg shook his head. Susan saw him first. I've never seen her go pale that fast. I thought maybe she was just surprised to see me early. Then I turned around and saw another guy walking in with a pumpkin pie. I leaned against the nearest wall because I genuinely needed support. So, what did you do? I asked. Greg shrugged. I sat there, watched her try to pretend it was normal. Watched Mark start talking to her mom like he'd been her son-in-law for years. Watched her sister come in, say hi to both of us like this was a completely normal setup. And then, about 5 minutes in, her dad made a toast about how happy he was to have all of us here. I was done. I was so incredibly done. Greg folded his arms. So yeah, that's how I found out. I just stared at him. Greg, what did you do after that? Greg was silent for a second. Then, very seriously, he said, I ate my Thanksgiving dinner. Because if I was going to get humiliated, I was at least getting a full plate out of it. For the first time in the past hour, I actually laughed. Because, honestly, fair enough. I stood there, staring at Greg, a man who had just casually dropped the most absurd Thanksgiving story in history. So let me get this straight, I said, still trying to process the sheer stupidity of it all. Susan's mom sent the wrong invitation. You walked into the Mark edition of Thanksgiving, and instead of calling her out, you just sat there and had dinner? Greg nodded. You didn't say anything? Nope. You didn't throw a scene? Nope. You just ate a full plate of food and left? Correct. I paused. Greg, that's either the smartest or dumbest thing I've ever heard, and I have no idea which. Greg shrugged. Figured I'd gather intel first. No point in blowing everything up without knowing the full situation. I hated how much sense that made. And now, standing in the middle of a Knicks Stadium concourse, I realized something very important. I had been playing checkers. Susan had been playing 4D chess. But Greg? Greg had read the whole rulebook and was now playing his own game. I exhaled. All right. So, what do you want to do? Greg smirked. That depends. You want revenge? I gave him a look. Greg, I just found out my wife has more husbands than most people have credit cards. What do you think? He grinned. Good. Because I've been working on something. Of course you have. Greg pulled out his phone again, tapping through his notes like he was about to give me a PowerPoint presentation on how to ruin Susan's life. Here's the deal, he said. Susan's built an entire web of lies, right? Multiple husbands, different schedules, fake explanations whenever she disappears. She's put a lot of work into this. Yeah, I muttered. Clearly. But the one thing she hasn't prepared for, Greg continued, is all of us finding out at the same time. I frowned. What are you getting at? Greg turned his phone screen toward me. It was a group chat, and at the top, a title that sent a chill down my spine. Susan's support group. I blinked. Greg, I swear to everything. If you tell me there are more husbands in that chat, he laughed. Relax. Right now, it's just me and Mark. I stared at him. Mark is in there? Yeah, Greg said, scrolling through the messages. Took a while, but I managed to make him see the truth. He was in deep denial for a bit. Thought I was some random trying to mess with his marriage. I raised an eyebrow. And how'd you convince him? Greg smirked. Sent him a screenshot of the shared calendar. Ah, I said. That'll do it. Anyway, Greg continued, I was planning to find a way to loop you in eventually, but I guess fate handled that part for me. I rubbed my temples. So now we're just a support group for betrayed husbands? Not just that, Greg corrected. We're about to crash the system. I lowered my hand. Go on. Think about it, Greg said. Susan's whole operation works because we've been kept separate. But now, we're connected. And we all have information she never wanted us to have. I crossed my arms. And what exactly are you suggesting we do with that information? Greg grinned. Simple. We hit her where it hurts. I narrowed my eyes. And where's that? Greg held up a key. I frowned. What's that? He smirked. The key to Mark's apartment. I blinked. Mark just gave you his house key? Technically, Susan gave it to him, Greg said. And Mark decided it was time for a little home makeover. My stomach twisted. What do you mean, home makeover? Greg chuckled. Oh, you'll see. I wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the fact that Greg had clearly been planning this for a long time, or the fact that I was suddenly completely on board. All right, I said. What's step one? Greg grinned. Step one? We invite Susan over for a nice little surprise. This was about to get very interesting. Greg and I stood outside Mark's apartment, a place that, until today, I didn't even know existed, yet somehow, my wife had been living a part-time life here. Greg tapped his phone, sending a quick message. All right, he said. Susan's on her way. I exhaled. And she thinks she's just coming to see Mark? Yup, Greg said, pocketing his phone. Now let's get everything set up. We stepped inside. Mark was already there, looking more stressed than anyone who had 3 separate husbands meeting in his apartment for revenge purposes should be. She responded? Mark asked. Greg nodded. She'll be here in 20. Mark rubbed his face. I can't believe this is happening. I gave him a look. Dude, you had no idea she was married to all of us? Mark groaned. She told me you guys were her cousins. I physically recoiled. What? Greg actually laughed. Mark threw up his hands. She said she had a big family and that some of her relatives were always in and out of town. I shook my head. Susan really told you that her other husbands were just visiting family members? Mark sighed. I trusted her. I had so many things to say about that, but I let it go. Greg clapped his hands together. All right, we've got 20 minutes. Let's make this count. The plan was simple. Susan had built a whole system to keep her fake marriages running smoothly. Now we were going to overload it. Greg pulled out his laptop, and I watched as he opened a presentation. Are you serious? I asked. You made a PowerPoint? Yes, Greg said. This is a structured event, Joe. Mark peered over. Wait, is that a financial breakdown? Greg grinned. Oh, you're gonna love this part. See, Susan had been careful with her operation, but even the best planners make mistakes. And Greg? Greg had been tracking those mistakes. From unexplained transactions to duplicate hotel reservations under different names, Greg had compiled a full financial spreadsheet of Susan's web of lies. All right, I said, crossing my arms. Let's ruin her life. 15 minutes later, everything was in place. And right on time, there was a knock at the door. Mark took a deep breath and opened it. Susan walked in, all smiles. Hey, babe. Then she saw me, and Greg, and the color drained from her face. I could see the exact second her brain tried to come up with a way out. She opened her mouth, probably about to launch into some absolute nonsense excuse. Greg beat her to it. Hey, Susan, he said, cheerfully. Take a seat. We made a presentation. Susan blinked. A what? A presentation, Greg repeated, clicking the first slide. Let's go through it together. Susan's eyes flicked between all 3 of us. I don't know what this is about. Slide 1, Greg continued, ignoring her. Your husbands. The screen filled with photos. Me, Greg, Mark, Jumbotron guy. Susan made an actual choking noise. Mark shook his head. Susan, what the hell? Susan took a slow step back. This isn't what it looks like. Slide 2, Greg announced. Your scheduling system. The shared calendar popped up on the screen, complete with color-coded time slots. I felt nothing anymore. Mark let out a long, slow breath. Susan, you gave me a Tuesday through Thursday schedule and told me you were working overtime the rest of the week. Greg grinned. I was Monday and Thursday. Susan was visibly panicking now. Slide 3, Greg continued, delighted. Your finances. And this was where the real fun started. Because Susan had been funding her whole operation with our money. And Greg had receipts. This is your account activity, Greg said, clicking through. Notice anything weird? Because I did. For example, Joe, see this charge? I leaned in and immediately recognized it. That's my credit card. Greg nodded. Yup. And it's paying for Mark's apartment. Mark's entire soul left his body. Wait. Mark stared at Susan. You had Joe paying for MY Place? Susan looked like she was about to faint. Greg clicked another tab. Oh, it gets better. Because Susan was also using Mark's money for Jumbotron guy's car. Silence. Just pure, dead silence. Then Mark snapped. Susan, you. Greg held up a hand. Wait, one more thing. And then, Greg printed something out, handed it to Susan. Susan looked down. Her face collapsed. I stepped forward. What is that? Greg smiled. That's Susan's lease agreement. I frowned. For what? Greg turned to Mark. For the house you thought you owned. Mark froze. I own this place. Nope, Greg said. Turns out, Susan does. You just pay for it. Mark turned to Susan. Tell me this isn't true. Susan said nothing. Greg clapped his hands. And that, gentlemen, concludes our presentation. Susan looked broken. No excuses left. No lies that could fix this. Just the reality of being caught. I took a deep breath. Susan, we're done? Mark nodded. More than done. Greg grinned. Oh, way done. Susan didn't fight it. She just stared at the screen, at the web of lies she had spent years creating, and watched it collapse. I grabbed my jacket. Greg, Mark, pleasure meeting you. Greg smirked. Let's never do this again. Mark shook his head. Yeah, seriously. We walked out, leaving Susan alone in the wreckage. I thought walking out of Mark's apartment would feel like victory, like some grand finale where the credits roll, and I get to drive off into a new, less ridiculous chapter of my life. Instead, it felt more like leaving a burning building and realizing you forgot your wallet inside. Greg was the first to break the silence as we stood outside. So, he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. What now? I exhaled. I have no idea. Mark shook his head, still looking like someone had unplugged his brain. She really owned my place? Greg nodded. Yup. She told me it was in my name, Mark muttered. Yeah, Greg said. And she told me she was training for a marathon. I should have known she was lying the second I realized she never ran anywhere. I let out a short laugh, then sighed. I need a lawyer. Greg smirked. You and me both, buddy. Mark still hadn't moved. He was staring at his own door like he was waiting for it to explode. You think she's still in there? He asked. Greg shrugged. I mean, she's got nowhere else to go. Technically, she's standing in the only house she actually owns. Mark groaned, rubbing his face. I can't believe I've been paying rent to my own wife. Honestly, Greg said, that's a level of stupidity that's impressive. No offense. Mark looked like he was about to throw himself into traffic. I checked my phone. No messages from Susan. Not that I was expecting any. The reality was sinking in now. It was over. The web of lies she had built, the routine she had perfected, it had all collapsed in a single night. I should have been happy. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt exhausted. Greg clapped me on the back. Well, Joe, it's been real. I turned to him. What's your plan? Greg stretched. Get a divorce. Go to therapy. Probably sit in my car for a while and rethink every life decision that led me here. Mark let out a dry laugh. Yeah, that sounds about right. Greg grinned. Well, gentlemen, it's been terrible meeting you. Then he turned and walked off, whistling like he hadn't just participated in a multi-husband intervention. Mark sighed. I guess I should go pack my stuff? I nodded. Yeah, probably a good idea. He hesitated. Joe? Yeah. Mark looked at me. Do you think she even? He stopped himself. Never mind. I knew what he was asking. Did Susan even love any of us? I didn't have an answer, so I just shook my head. See you around, Mark. I walked away. By the time I got home, Susan was waiting for me. She was standing outside our apartment, arms crossed, looking less like a woman who had been caught in a massive web of betrayal and more like someone who had just been mildly inconvenienced. I took one look at her and sighed. Susan, I'm not doing this. She held up a hand. Just let me talk. I unlocked the door. Nope. Joe. I stepped inside. Susan, I don't need an explanation. She followed me in. I turned to her. You had 4 husbands. You made a calendar. You ran a marriage Ponzi scheme and somehow managed to use all of our money against us. What is there to explain? Susan opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time tonight, she had nothing. I dropped my keys on the table and sighed. I already called a lawyer. I don't care what you do next. I don't care where you go. Just go. She didn't move. Instead, she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a full laugh. Not hysterical. Just a quiet, almost amused chuckle. I stared at her. Susan, are you seriously laughing right now? She smirked. You have to admit, it was impressive. I blinked. Excuse me? Susan shrugged. Come on, Joe. It worked for years. I managed 4 marriages without anyone noticing. I held up a hand. Stop talking. I am 1 second away from jumping out that window, just so I don't have to hear whatever nonsense is about to come out of your mouth. She actually looked offended. Susan, I said slowly, trying not to lose my mind. You are a psychopath. She rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Don't be dramatic. I had to physically restrain myself from throwing my own furniture. Instead, I took a deep breath. Get out. Susan stared at me for a long moment. Then, finally, she exhaled. Fine. She walked to the door, opened it, then paused. By the way, she said over her shoulder, Jumbotron guy's name is Eric. I stared at her. She smirked. You were dying to know. And then she left. Just like that. No apology. No fake excuses. Nothing. Just a woman who had built an empire of deception and was now walking away like she had just lost a minor business deal. I stood there for a long time. Then, finally, I sat down. And I laughed. Because what else was there to do? Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel